Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's disability information video. This is our first video of the series, and I'm very excited to cover this week's topic. So this week we're going to be discussing ADHD, or in other words, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So what is ADHD? Well, in short, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, big word, that's characterized by a pervasive pattern of increased inattention or hyperactivity/impulsivity that interferes with normal functioning. So there's a lot of big words in there, so I'll try to go over them slowly. So first, neurodevelopmental disorder. That means that it's a disorder that affects the functioning of the brain in a child's development. So because it affects the functioning of the brain and it's a psychological disorder, the criteria for diagnosing this disorder is laid out in what's called the DSM-5, which is basically the manual that clinical psychologists use for diagnosing mental disorders such as ADHD. So now that I've kind of laid out a bit of what a neurodevelopmental disorder is, I'm going to go through exactly what it means to have ADHD. So I mentioned that ADHD involves increased inattention or hyperactivity/impulsivity. So there's kind of two main traits of ADHD that kind of form the core of what it means to have the disorder. And these two main traits, inattention and hyperactivity/impulsivity, are thought to kind of vary in the individual who has ADHD. In other words, not everyone who has ADHD is going to be at the same level of inattention or the same level of hyperactivity/impulsivity. So there's kind of different types of ADHD depending on the person. So I'll outline exactly what I mean by each of these two things right now. So inattention is basically what it sounds like. It's not paying attention. It's being unable really to pay attention. So what this might look like is things, I have a little list here that I'll glance at and read. Basically it means that the individual doesn't pay attention to detail. They make frequent mistakes due to their lack of attention. They don't seem like they're listening. It's hard for them to stay focused. So this ends up meaning that they're not good at following up with instructions. They have problems organizing their work, and they often lose things or may be easily distracted. Now, all of these traits may not be present in every individual with ADHD, but on average, more of these traits are present than not present. So for someone to have kind of this inattentive trait that's associated with ADHD, they're going to have a lot of these kind of inattentive qualities, such as not paying attention or being unable to organize their work or missing certain details. So that's what inattention kind of means. And now I'm going to outline exactly what hyperactivity/impulsivity means. So we say them together because they're kind of thought to move together and be somewhat related, even though they kind of have different qualities associated with them. So what's meant by hyperactivity/impulsivity is basically that the person, it's sort of what it sounds like. So for example, someone might fidget or tap their feet. So that would be like hyperactivity. So imagine someone like drumming their fingers or kind of vibrating their leg. Those are common signs of hyperactivity. It's kind of this very active state where the person just wants to move and get going. So that makes it very difficult when someone's in class, for example, in a situation where they're supposed to be sitting still and they're supposed to be kind of paying attention. It makes it difficult for that person to kind of follow the social norms in those areas. So yeah, another thing that someone with hyperactivity/impulsivity may do is things like finishing people's sentences before they're finished speaking, and it generally involves a trouble waiting for his or her turn. So it's just hard for them to kind of wait for everyone to take their space. They just want to kind of get going. So that's sort of what hyperactivity and impulsivity means. So now that I've kind of described exactly what ADHD is, I wanted to kind of cover a bit more in depth some common misconceptions or try to kind of illuminate exactly what it means to have ADHD. So one thing that people don't really understand about ADHD is that it's actually a deficit in attention. What people often think is that ADHD children have more energy and they just are bubbling with energy and they have too much. It's too much activity in their brain. But actually, ADHD is caused by a deficit in your brain. You don't have enough attention to stop yourself from performing certain activities. That's why things like an impulsive subtype exist. So it's like, basically with ADHD, you can't prevent yourself from doing certain actions. It's not that you want to do actions constantly, it's that you're unable to stop yourself. So that's what it means to have an actual deficit in attention. And that's why ADHD is most commonly treated with stimulant medication, which is surprising to most people because stimulant medication increases the activity in your brain. It makes your brain more, it means your brain is doing more. So to give people with ADHD who seem to be all energetic and moving constantly something that would increase the activity of their brain seems somewhat counterintuitive. But the reason that we do this is because ADHD is actually a deficit in attention. So we treat it with stimulant medication because we need people with ADHD, or not need, but the goal is to help people with ADHD acquire more focus so that they actually can pay attention and can actually limit their body from just moving without thinking about it. And so now that I've talked about how ADHD is actually a deficit in attention, I also wanted to cover a couple other misconceptions about ADHD. And one very common myth that's very relevant in the culture is that ADHD only affects boys. Oftentimes, teachers especially and parents believe that because boys are perceived as more rowdy or rambunctious and are more disruptive in classes, that they are the only ones who are affected by ADHD. But actually, ADHD can affect both boys and girls. The reason that girls are often not seen to have ADHD is because they are more often than not more in line with the inattentive subtype. This means that instead of getting up and moving around and being energetic and standing up in the middle of class, they're just not really able to pay attention or focus. So this ends up not making them noticed in the eyes of a teacher in class, for example, who would probably notice someone getting up in class instead. So the reason for the underdiagnosis in women is essentially because the symptoms that they present with are different than the symptoms that boys often present with. So they're less likely to be hyperactive and more likely to be inattentive. And finally, one thing that I really want to emphasize with this whole ADHD is actually a deficit in mind is the fact that people with ADHD aren't lazy. It's often thought that people with ADHD need to just put in the work and just sit down and work hard, and it's just behavioral issues that are causing their problems. But as I mentioned, ADHD is a deficit in attention. This means that their brain it's actually unable to create the resources needed to focus. So it's not good enough to just tell someone with ADHD that they just need to focus because their brain is actually preventing them from doing so. And so now that I've addressed these misconceptions and kind of explained what ADHD is, I think it's time to wrap up this portion of the video and move on into our next portion of the video, which will be an interview with someone with lived experience with ADHD. So please join me with that coming up in a couple seconds. I will see you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second portion of this week's disability information video. Joining me for our very first interview of the series is a special guest to me personally, and that is my mother, who is Michelle Redfern. So thank you for joining me this week, Michelle, Mom.
Pleasure.
So I'm just going to acknowledge a bit of the perspective that you're coming to this video from. So because I think it's worth mentioning, you actually only recently got diagnosed with ADHD. So for the majority of your life, you were not aware that you had ADHD. So I just wanted to point that out to our audience, that this is coming from a pretty unique perspective. And I think it's a valuable perspective because there's probably a lot of other people out there who might be in a similar situation as you, where they may not know that they had ADHD their whole life. So that's why I think this is sort of a valuable interview to have. So now I'm going to get going on the questions I have prepared today. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, what are two aspects of your life that ADHD affects that other people might not know or think about?
Okay, well, I guess if a lot of people are like me, which I'm a social worker, but for some reason I didn't really understand the nuances of ADHD and how it moves in people in unique and diverse ways. And I just assumed, I held the stereotype of the distractible but engaging and captivating, often young boy who couldn't sit still in class and would, blurt out things at inappropriate times. And now I know that a lot of that was ADHD, and I'm very thankful for it, because I also didn't know that people with ADHD are interest focused. So they are able to get things done if they're interested in them. Attention deficit, I'm not sure if it's a deficit of attention or if it's a surplus of attention, that we're just interested in many, many things. And what is deemed important by the teacher or important by society or important by the Canada Revenue Agency is not necessarily what is important to us. What's important to us is what we're interested in. And in order to compensate, I think I had to make things interesting to me, and that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work to make things interesting to me, and it took a lot of time. And and I just never thought that person had ADHD.
Yeah, no, I think this is exactly why I thought this sort of interview would be very beneficial, because it sort of, you represent kind of perhaps an underrepresented segment of the population, which is, women with ADHD who weren't necessarily noticed in class because the type of ADHD they have is not this bouncing around, like hyperactive, type of ADHD where people actually notice it. It kind of flies under the radar until you realize that these issues kind of affect your life later on. So that's why I'm glad you sort of shared that perspective of someone who didn't realize that ADHD was something that might be affecting you, because your conception of ADHD was completely different from how you are as a person. Now moving on into my next question, what I wanted to ask you was, what have been two of the most important things for you in managing ADHD? Now, obviously this has been a pretty recent thing for you, so I don't expect you to have big life habits worked out already, but just some insights that you might be able to give.
It's very fresh for me. I'm still learning. And I would say that's the most important thing for me right now, is just learning. It's learning about it. It's talking to people. It's reading books, listening to podcasts, taking courses just to learn about it. I'm fascinated by the topic. And as someone who's always drawn to help others, I feel like there's so many people that could benefit from this information and knowledge, and it can be integrated into so many different aspects of human service where it's not right now, this specialized knowledge. So that's one thing, just learning. And another thing would be focusing on strengths, focusing on the positive. The ADHD brain, apparently, all of us tend to gravitate to the negative. Negative thoughts tend to get through into our brains more easily. But the ADHD brain is much more drawn to negative thinking. And so being intentional to focus on the positive, to focus on my strengths, to find out what my strengths are, to intentionally remember times where I've been successful, and to examine those and then to apply those to struggles in my life. I mean, it's a journey, but I think approaching things from a strength based lens is much more activating and interesting for me than to just focus on my deficits and struggles all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think those are two really important insights, for anyone who might even recently stumble on the fact that they have some disorder that they didn't know about, just learning about it and understanding how it might affect your life in different ways from other people is huge to the kind of that self-development that comes from, learning that you have this disorder. And then, approaching it also from the strengths-based perspective and kind of acknowledging that it's not necessarily a problem that you have ADHD, it's just a difference. So a lot of it comes down to the fact that, you're not necessarily worse or at a disadvantage from other people. You just think differently, and you have different strengths, and those strengths can be used to other people's benefits just as other people's strengths can be. So I think those two things are very important to mention, both for ADHD and for all disorders, is to focus on learning and focus on strengths. So now that we've kind of covered a bit about what it's like to have ADHD and some of the things that are important for managing it, we're going to sort of shift to the second portion of our interview, which is sort of, we want to spread a bit of positivity through this series. So the question I wanted to ask you is, what sort of things really make your day?
What things make my day? Connection. Genuine connection. I now know, perhaps this is because of my ADHD, but I tend to not be very good at small talk, and I tend to get deep with people pretty quickly. And most people actually seem to like it. So I thrive on connection. I thrive on sharing. I thrive on inclusion, finding ways to include people and to facilitate their belonging and their ability to have a voice when perhaps there's barriers in place that have prevented that. I like fun. I'm a very curious person. I like to learn new things. I like to be creative. But really what really lights me is opportunities to learn from others and to just learn together with others.
Yeah, I would say I have to strongly agree with that one, which was part of the motivation behind this series. So I think great answers. And now moving on into our last question today. What I wanted to ask you is, what words of empowerment or encouragement would you give to people with ADHD?
Well, I guess I've made it to 51 without knowing that I had ADHD. And I'm thankful that I do now, because I was pretty down on myself about things that I now know are just a difference in my brain. And if I had known what I know now, I might have approached some things a little differently. And I do believe that if everyone just focuses on figuring out what their strengths are and what they're passionate about, and lean into those passions, as opposed to try and fit into a box that the neurotypical world has said is normal, but it's not necessarily normal. And that we focus on ADHD as just a difference, a diversity, as opposed to a disorder or a deficit. That I think it's an exciting time. I think the world is shifting in this way. And I think that honestly, everyone I meet, including that boy who's running around the classroom and who can't sit still and who's disrupting things, there's an energy and a vitality in them that I just find captivating. And I know that they have gifts to offer the world. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think it's, as you say, it's very much about approaching it from a strengths-based perspective and recognizing that ADHD is something that, it may affect you negatively in some ways, but it may affect you positively in other ways. And it's important to acknowledge the strengths and also try to find a situation or a part of reality that you can fit yourself into and use those strengths for the benefit of others, you know? So I think, you know, that strengths-based perspective is a really important perspective to share to both people with ADHD and to everyone in general, I think. So thank you so much for joining us this week for our first disability information video. I hope the audience enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing everyone in our upcoming video next week. See you all then. Thank you.
Goodbye, my child.
Bye.